really excited to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for reaching out.
Yeah. So I'm Ivanka. I'm a high school student, and I'm really passionate about climate and sustainability. And I first got interested in methane emissions specifically when I did my research project at the U of M. And I did it in reducing methane emissions from livestock using feed additives. So that was really exciting. And then I got into this whole methane thing. And then I started my initiative, MethaneMatters, to educate people about methane emissions, like the sources and then impacts and mitigation strategies. And I also wrote this book on methane emissions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Which goes into a lot more detail than any of my videos on this channel do. And yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast to talk about plants and water, which I haven't done much in.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Cynthia Gerlein-Safdi. I am an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in civil environmental engineering. And I have been at Berkeley for about 4 years now. And my background is actually in geophysics and geophysical engineering. So really more on the kind of underground, right, like geology side of things. And I studied how to use different physical kind of techniques to study what's below ground. So using electromagnetic inductions, ground penetrating radar, this kind of techniques to kind of get a better picture of the type of rocks that are below ground or how moist the soil is. So this kind of problematics. And then I did both my undergraduate and my graduate studies in France, in Strasbourg, which is at the border with Germany, which is where kind of very near where I'm from. So I grew up in that area, the border between France, Switzerland, and Germany, and then stayed it for my studied, and then had the opportunity to do a semester of research during my master's at Princeton. And I essentially ended up doing my PhD with the same advisor that I had there at Princeton in civil environmental engineering. And I switched a little bit, so I moved away from soils and kind of underground geology kind of topics and did my PhD on plants. And part of the reason that I kind of went from geology to plants was that my project for my master's thesis was on trying to use some of those techniques that we use to look at rocks and soil moisture and trying to instead look at roots from plants. So trying to map roots of a tree using, without having to dig them up, using those different techniques. So I got interested in plants that way. And then for my PhD, I studied dew deposition and how dew water can kind of modify how plants interact with the environment, right? Because now they're wet and there's this sort of layer of water on top of them. So it changes their water, obviously, water cycle, but it also impacts their energy and carbon cycles.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah. And the last thing I will add is from there, I actually went and switched a little bit after my PhD and did a lot of remote sensing. So using satellite data to look at planet. Initially, I also wanted to look at dew, but I ended up looking a lot more at flooding and kind of surface water inundation, which is really kind of, I think, where some of this links back to the methane question. So
how did you get into studying like methane and other gases?
So kind of by accident, I will say. I'm a hydrologist. I consider myself someone interested in water and kind of how water flows, and also interested in plants. And I was telling one of my colleagues at the time I was at the University of Michigan, I was telling them how I was making those maps of inundation. And some of it is, short-term flooding, but actually a lot of what we see when we make those kind of global scale maps of where you have, water above ground ends up being wetlands. Where wetlands are, how they are kind of evolving, during the rainy season, increasing in size and then decreasing in size during the dry season. And so we could see all these dynamics. And I was explaining this to a colleague of mine who is working much more on methane emissions from sort of anthropogenic sources, right? So kind of very small but concentrated sources of methane. And he was like, oh, well, this is actually a very kind of somewhat open question for the methane community, because we don't know very well where those wetlands are, but they are a very big source of methane emissions. And it sounds like your maps are maybe better than what we have so far. And so I ended up collaborating with him and then some of his colleagues on using those maps and then modeling what the expected methane emissions would be with these kind of new visions that we had on how big the wetlands are. So that's kind of how I got into this very interesting and difficult question.
Yeah. So with the anthropogenic sources, I know rice paddies are some of them, and there's also wetlands. So could you explain more about like the sources from water of methane?
Yeah, so the link here, right, is that the microbes that are producing the methane sort of need to be wet for the methane production to be happening. And so when you have a wetland or when you inundate, right, a rice paddy, then you're sort of giving those microbes what they need to really be in the right environment to start producing methane. And so, right, you have those kind of the natural ways with the wetlands or the sort of more human-driven emissions through the kind of agricultural aspects of rice paddies. But it is essentially the exact same process, which is that the soil, right, needs to be submerged for the methane to start being produced.
Okay. And then, so what kind of projects are you doing now?
So we are essentially continuing on the mapping of the wetlands. One of our main projects, which is led by one of my PhD students, is to extend the maps that we have. So we were using a very unique type of satellite called Cygnus to do the mapping of those wetlands. And Cygnus is very cool because it's actually a constellation of 8 satellites, and they kind of follow each other around the world. And they were launched to look at tropical cyclones, but it turns out, so over the ocean, but it turns out that they also can see water on continents very well. So it's sort of like this sort of side idea in terms of how to use this data. And it works really well. And one really important thing about this data is that Cygnus is able to see wetlands even when it's very cloudy or even when there's a lot of vegetation above the water, which for tropical wetlands is very important because during the rainy season, for example, over the Amazon, there's clouds for pretty much 4 months straight. And so a lot of classic ways that we have to look at wetlands, which is essentially just taking kind of photos, right? Optical photos, the same way that you would take a photo with your phone. If you just take a photo of the surface from a satellite, all you see is clouds and you don't see the water. But with Cygnus, we're actually able to see through because it operates in microwaves. And so it really allowed us to see wetlands at times where we hadn't been able to see them before. The one issue with Cygnus is that because it was designed for tropical cyclones, it only goes to about 38 degrees north to 38 degrees south. So it sees just about above like where San Francisco is, but we can't see any of the boreal ecosystems. And so one big questions that we have is how quickly are those boreal ecosystems changing with all the melting that is happening, right? The Arctic and the kind of northern part of the northern hemisphere is warming up much faster than the rest of the globe, and so we know that this melt is now giving the perfect conditions during the summer for methane to be emitted by those high latitudes, tundras and kind of high latitude ecosystems. And so we're trying to use other satellites that do the same thing as Cygnus, but are also kind of covering this high latitude zones so that we can do the same maps and then work with the same people on modeling what the emissions from those high latitude wetlands, right, that happen only during the summer, but how much methane is being emitted. And then we can also, because we're modeling the methane emissions, we can also, for example, impose climate scenarios to look at what the trajectory might be in terms of the methane emissions from this high latitude ecosystems. And it's a lot of work because we don't have as good of data in those parts of the world as we did with the Cygnus data in the tropics. So it's taking quite a bit of tweaking things and gathering data from different sources. Yeah.
So what kind of data do you use to help determine what methane emissions are coming off of these water bodies?
So again, right, what we really work on is the extent of the water. Mm-hmm. And so we make those new maps that just tell you, in a given pixel, how much is covered by water versus dry land. And then the assumption is that if it's covered in water, then there might be methane being emitted. And then what the model takes is essentially environmental conditions, right? So sort of like your classic kind of temperature, pressure, and just modeling what the emission rate would be in the kind of current environmental conditions in this much water, right? So it says if I have 50% of my pixel covered in water, so this is this much of an area, and then we know that there is kind of this rate of production of methane for a given area. And so that's sort of what we use. And then we have compared our results, so which are modeled, right? We're not actually kind of measuring. The only thing we're measuring is the water side, not the actual methane. And then we have been comparing our results with satellites that can see methane in the atmosphere. So for example, TRPOMI. And TRPOMI sees kind of how much methane is in sort of your entire column of atmosphere. And what we do is we compare how much we know is being emitted from your wetland at the base, and then compared to kind of what we call the enhancement in methane. So we know that there should be some methane in the atmospheric column, and then how much sort of extra are we measuring with the TRPOMI satellite, which sees the concentration of methane in the air. So how much kind of extra is there measured, and can this kind of match what we're seeing being emitted?
Oh, okay. So you use modeling. Do you also use technologies like computer vision or anything else?
Yeah, so we use computer vision actually for mapping the water. And the reason for that is that sometimes we, when you look at the terrain, when you want to look at a wetland, you might have, very small rivers coming into like a bigger area that is inundated. And so it's been really helpful to have a way to kind of prompt the maps essentially to, for example, connect rivers together, because sometimes the background is a little different, or there's kind of a bit of a canyon in one area of the river, and so we don't necessarily see it very well. But we know that the river, should be essentially connected all the way through. There should really be kind of a stop, and then it starts again, for example. And so we use a computer vision algorithm, which is very simple. It's not. It's essentially a segmentation method, which is called the random walker algorithm, and it allows us to kind of group what is wet and what is dry together. And then essentially each pixel that we sort of know for sure is wet or know for sure is wet because the signal is very strong or very weak. And then those pixels are sort of going to diffuse in random directions. And when they find a strong gradient, they're essentially going to stop. And so it's going to help kind of put together all the wet pixels and all the dry pixels that we're seeing in our satellite data, and help kind of differentiate the pixels that might be, kind of in between, where the signal is neither very strong nor very weak. So what we call noisy data. So it's very good at looking at a noisy image, essentially, right? You can imagine something where you had some white, some black, and then a lot of gray, right? Yeah. So it's very good at partitioning this kind of images. And so it's a pretty old method, but it still works really well, and it doesn't require kind of any additional data or any training, because it's really just a statistical method.
Okay. So to do all this stuff, what kind of people do you have in your team? Like, do you have experts in computer vision and modeling versus people in ecology, or?
Yeah, so my team is kind of a mixture, as you say, of people who are more, who are really good at the kind of computing side of things. So harnessing a lot of data, right, because we're collecting all this satellite data, which takes kind of a lot of effort and kind of savvy techniques in terms of the computing to really put together and extract information from, and who are, very efficient at, I would say, the coding aspect and the algorithm, right, that it takes to kind of put this data together, extract information, run the model for the methane. And then on the other hand, I have kind of the other half of my group that does things more related to my PhD work on dew deposition. And so they have kind of a very strong, more field-based and kind of lab-based training, where they they know a lot more about how kind of plants function at, like, the cellular level or the leaf level, and so very much more on the biology side of things. With that being said, everybody in my group, I think, identifies as a hydrologist, and everybody kind of is trained in all those different aspects to some degree, right? It's just that on a day-to-day basis, right, they might use some of the skills more than the other. And so usually kind of by the end of the PhD, even though they all gotten kind of a very similar coursework and training, and they're able to talk to each other, some might kind of feel like they are stronger on some of the aspects or the other.
Okay. So in your work, you work in the tropics, and then, so do you do projects all around the world?
So the beauty with satellite data is that you don't really have to travel anywhere to do any of this, right? So a lot of our focus was on the tropics because of the Cygnus data. The maps that we're producing are, again, 38 north to south, which is kind of beyond the tropics, really, right? It goes into the subtropics. But we didn't ourselves do any kind of field work with this. Some people in the kind of broader Cygnus community have gone out and gotten some data. There's also a lot of kind of information and data available, through other groups that we can use. We do more field work on this kind of other side of my work, more related to kind of plant level cycling. And so we have some field sites here in California, and I have a project where one of my students is actually about to go to Massachusetts and Kansas to install some sensors. But that is really more kind of thinking about, plants and water within the canopy. So,
Okay. And then what groups do you collaborate with to get the data, like the satellite data?
Yeah. So satellite data itself is from NASA is free for everybody to access and use. And so you can go online, get the data that you need. In terms of actually kind of interpreting the data and running the model, for example, so we collaborate with Anthony Bloom, who is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena in California, which is a NASA laboratory. So Anthony has a lot of expertise in developing this methane emissions model and kind of taking in different sources of information and running different versions of the model. So he's been the one kind of helping us lead this modeling aspect. And then we are also collaborating with Eric Court at the University of Michigan, who is the person I was mentioning who does a lot of the kind of more point sources, methane emissions tracking. He flies a lot of those small aircrafts where he goes and samples flask of air to look at methane concentrations. So those are, I would say, our two main collaborators in this area. But we have actually been expanding the kind of number of people we work on kind of methane emissions, because people have developed different models for methane emissions. And a lot of them have been curious to see, well, if we take your new maps of wetlands, what does it tell? Like, how does it change our results? So we've collaborated with a few different people, some in Paris, some in China, some on the East Coast, to essentially embed our wetland maps into their own models.
That's cool. So you mentioned challenges with getting the data itself. Are there any other challenges you face in the whole process?
I think there's just a lot of things that we still don't know. We still don't know well, and so sometimes it makes it for a bit of a difficult interpretation, right? I would say a big one is in understanding what the most important things are for methane emissions, because we know that extent was a big source of uncertainty, right? Because it's been quantified, and we know that in many areas there just wasn't good information about how big the wetlands are. And so if you don't know how big it is, then you can be off by a factor of however bad your wetland extent was originally. But even if we get this, even if we improve on this with our new Cygnus data, then there's still the issue of what is the next thing that matters the most? Is it the temperature of the water, for example, or is it some mechanism in the way the sort of microbes are producing the methane, right? And so those steps are also still not very well known. And and so sometimes we see results that, so I'll give you a very concrete example. When we look at the trend in methane concentrations in the atmosphere over the last few years, we see an increase. But when and many people have attributed this to an increase in kind of wetland extent and just more emissions from the wetlands themselves, especially tropical wetlands, which are very, very productive for methane. But when we look at the extent of those wetlands, we see actually a pretty small decrease, but overall, over the last few years, and it's sort of more kind of related to some of those bigger cycles, right? Like ENSO that we have on our planet, probably. But so a small decrease in extent, which means that we can't really explain the big increase in emissions from or in concentrations from emissions from the wetlands. And so that means that there's probably, if it is coming from wetlands, then there's something that we're not understanding about the way that they're producing the methane, right? Because the extent itself is not increasing. So maybe they're producing more now, and we're just not capturing this increase in the emissions as well as we thought, right, in our models. So still a lot of aspects that we just don't fully understand about those kind of large scale, right, methane emissions. And so I think that's a big challenge, and that's something that we're sort of interested in looking more into, although, right, it's sort of always the issue of scale, because we can study some of those processes very well in the lab, for example, but then how well are some of these results really going to hold up once we say, all right, we take what we learned from the lab and now we apply it to the entire world. Like that's a pretty big jump that sometimes doesn't quite work.
Yeah. So what does your day-to-day look like as a researcher? Do you spend most of your time in the lab or on the field or anything else?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, as a professor, there's still a big part of my day that is spent teaching, preparing for teaching when it's, when the semester is in session. So that's still a big portion of what I do. And this fall I'm teaching about over 100 undergraduate students for our hydrology course. So it takes quite a bit of organization. And then the rest of my time, I do a lot of, I would say, more kind of mentoring of my graduate students, who are really the ones, I would say, leading the charge on the, kind of day-to-day progress of the actual research. And then I sort of meet with all of them, provide feedback on their, what they've been doing. We meet every week, and then decide on sort of what should be tried next. And then, sort of loop back. I also do a lot of reading and writing. That is, I would say, a bigger portion of sort of the science or the research that I do, which is writing about the results that we obtain with my students, writing proposals to support financially these students, and then also, reading manuscripts that they are writing, and providing kind of feedback, detailed feedback on what they are producing and how we are sort of communicating from our research group to the broader community.
Okay. Do you have a lot of students in your lab? And then what roles do they have?
Yeah. I have 6 PhD students, and then 1 master's student, and we always have a few undergraduate students who are kind of helping out, usually for a semester or for the year. So usually, about, a small dozen students in the group. And I would say that everybody has kind of their own projects. They are pretty independent from each other. And so it's a pretty kind of horizontal hierarchy, I guess, in terms of roles, where they are each kind of working on their own projects, doing either the kind of coding that they need to be doing or their like lab work. And we do have some overlap, so there's certainly also projects on which we have kind of multiple students collaborating together, especially with lab and field work, where we often need more than just one person, both for safety reasons and also for just practical reasons, because some of the equipment can be big and heavy. So I would say on that side, we tend to have kind of a little bit more kind of collaboration happening because it's needed.
Okay. So what advice would you give to someone like me or a high school student who wants to go into this field?
That's a really great question. I think one aspect that I always emphasize is that physics is really important in everything that we do. It's sort of the basis of a lot of what we study, right? From just the like thermodynamics of like a system to the like being able to understand how the atmosphere moves and how a plume of methane, for example, would get dispersed, right? All of this really kind of requires a solid physics background. And so I would, my one advice is usually that, focusing on the physics, focusing on those kind of fundamental aspects of putting how our world functions into equations is I think very key, and also just makes everything else easier, right? Once you've kind of established a solid baseline on that. So that's probably my main advice. And my second advice maybe is to remember that there's a lot of time, and not everything needs to be done right away, and it can be frustrating, especially when you get to college and at first the classes don't seem to be right, they might be too boring because it's like math and physics, and you're not really getting to like the more applied aspects or applications to the things that you're interested in. But I think it's important to remember that you have kind of your whole life to get to those questions, and it's important to kind of build that solid base on which to build. And also that you can have kind of multiple things you're interested in, and it's okay to kind of focus on some of them at one point and then not do it all at the same time all the time, which is something that I had to learn and that I'm sort of still learning. But not everything has to be done simultaneously, and you can focus on one thing, and then once the opportunity comes up, or you sort of feel like you're really ready to move on, you can focus on the next thing that you're like also passionate about.
Okay, thanks. I'll keep those in mind. Yeah, that's all the questions I had for the podcast, and I had so much fun learning about all your research. It sounds really cool.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I know I think my work is a little bit more kind of methane adjacent, maybe in a way, but I would say the methane community is the one that we work with the most. So, I was really glad to get a chance to kind of chat about this.